Have you ever been surprised by how easily someone you know has been talked into doing something by an expert or a person they believe has authority? Do you think there's a chance they could even be talked into doing something that might harm themselves, or even worse, a friend or a family member? Well, what if I told you that in 1961, a psychological experiment was conducted to determine just exactly how obedient people are? And for the last 60 plus years, the answer's been no. Do you think anyone in possession of this knowledge might ever have used it to coerce or mislead people? And if they did, and people were injured or died, should they be forgiven or should they be held accountable? Well, I promise you, if you watch this video until the very last line, the ending makes it very clear exactly what the consequences might and should be. Hello. For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by weird events that seem impossible but are true. And that's what this channel is all about, bringing strange, unbelievable stories to you once a week. So if you're a fan of the mysterious, the inexplicable, the unbelievable but true, subscribe, give me a like, hit the notification button, and I promise, with every new video, I'll do my best to keep blowing your mind. Okay, so we've all heard terrible stories about how during times of disaster, political upheaval, or war, some people have had no problem turning in neighbors, friends, and even family members because they've been told those people held the wrong beliefs. Well, have you ever wondered if anyone you know could be talked into doing that to you, even when they know what they're doing is wrong and you might be harmed or killed? And then, afterwards, when the truth comes out, and believe me, the truth always comes out, what excuse do you think they'll try to use to justify what they did? Do you think they'll just attempt to wave it off and say, hey, I was only following orders? Well, in June of 1961, a famous experiment was held about this exact situation. And I guarantee you, near the end of this video, when I tell you the results, you're going to start looking at the people around you in a whole different light. Because what was learned, and something that's been duplicated over and over again by similar experiments, producing the exact same results, should scare the hell out of you. Okay, so first we need to start at the very beginning of the story, which actually takes place about a month before the experiment began. Specifically, we need to look into the 4-month time period between April 11th and August 15th of 1961, when almost every evening around the world people sat in horror reading their newspapers or glued to their TVs, learning information coming out of the trial of a recently captured German war criminal named Adolf Eichmann. Now, if you're not familiar with who Eichmann is, to many people, soldiers and victims alike, during the Second World War, he was known simply as the conductor. The one man who delighted in and was primarily responsible for the capture, planning, and transportation by train across Europe of millions of men, women, and children to the gas chambers, where they were tortured and slaughtered. You see, Eichmann ultimately was the guy who decided whether you got to live or die. And he took great pleasure in making sure he got you there on time. And now, during this evil man's trial, the whole world learned that the only defense he felt he needed to give for the genocide he played a major part in was to say, hey, I was only following orders. Well, the experiment that began in June of that same year, right smack dab in the middle of Eichmann's trial, was directly influenced by his unbelievable statement of defense. In fact, the young psychologist Stanley Milgram, who devised the experiment, admitted in a 1974 book that Eichmann's statement was what instantly roused my interest. So, as the trial was going on, Milgram began what he called an obedience to authority experiment, deep in the basement beneath Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. And to say the results were eye-opening would be an understatement. As even today, most psychologists still agree Milgram's experiment had one of the most significant impacts ever on the study of human psychology. Okay, so first Milgram needed 40 volunteers for his experiment, and he got these by running a local newspaper ad searching for volunteers for what he said was a study of memory. And from these ads, and from his position as a professor in the university, he ended up with a wide variety of participants, including teachers, doctors, professors, students, as well as housewives and general laborers. And to entice them to volunteer, he paid them $4, enough back in 1961 to purchase 14 loaves of bread or 22 beers, or today, 2 loaves of bread and a half a beer. But hey, that's a whole different kind of coercion. Now, before the experiment began, Milgram had an official-looking scientific machine built, which he labeled a shock generator. And this machine, I tell you, it looked like something straight out of a mad scientist's lab. The thing was enormous and very serious looking, with a control panel covered in a series of switches, 30 of which were labeled in increments of 15 volts, all the way from 0 to 450. And then beneath all the switches was a set of colorful labels, so that as a person was using it, there was no way they wouldn't know exactly how large a shock they were giving someone, and how much damage it might inflict, because all the switches were also labeled as either a light shock, a moderate shock, a strong shock, a very strong shock, an intense shock, an extreme shock, all the way up to the last 3 switches being labeled as danger and XXX. In other words, flipping these switches could cause death. So, as I mentioned earlier, the experiments were held in the basement of the Lindsay Chittenden Hall on Yale University's old campus in June of 1961. First, Milgram introduced them to a stern-looking man wearing an official-looking white lab coat, who he called the instructor. And then he introduced him to a more pleasant-looking fellow, also wearing a white coat, who he called the observer. Now, it's important at this point that you know this observer was secretly just another volunteer he recruited from the same ad they'd all responded to. This man had absolutely no scientific training. Next, the stern-looking man, the instructor, he randomly separated all the volunteers into 2 groups and assigned them the role of either a teacher or learner. But actually, this wasn't random either, because unbeknownst to all the teachers, none of the learners were volunteers. They were paid actors. Next, every teacher and his learner were separated from the group, then took turns being strapped into a chair with wires attached to it. And both were given a sample shock of 45 volts, so they'd know exactly how it was going to feel when the teacher gave a jolt for an incorrect answer on the fake memory test. Then, both were told that for each additional incorrect answer, the learner's shocks would be increased by 15 volts. Okay, so now you can see the false story that had been set up. The teachers, they thought the experiment was intended to explore the effects on the learners of punishment they were going to receive for giving wrong answers on a fake memory test. When actually, the whole point of the experiment was to learn how obedient the teachers were going to be when they were told by the instructor to give powerful shocks to the learners. In other words, just how much pain were they willing to inflict, and how far would they go? Next, the teacher and his learner were separated and put into neighboring rooms, through which, as the experiment progressed, the teacher soon realized he could faintly hear his learner complaining and pleading to be released after receiving his first violent shock, saying that a heart condition or some other potentially fatal ailment. Now, you also have to understand that other than the very first sample shocks that everyone received, no other shocks were ever given or received by anyone. The shock machine also was a fake, thus the reason why the learners had to be actors. Now, before we dive into the final results, it's interesting to note that before anything took place, Milgram sought predictions from a variety of individuals about what they thought the outcome would be. And these individuals included psychiatrists, college students, middle-class adults, and even behavioral scientists at the university. And almost as one, they predicted the majority of the teachers would refuse to obey the orders of the instructor once they heard the learners crying out and knew they were causing them pain. They also believed that only 4% of the teachers would even consider administering an extreme shock of 300 volts, and that only a true psychopath, which would be like finding one person out of 1,000, would administer a potentially deadly triple X shock to an innocent person. In fact, the psychiatrist specifically predicted most teachers would never go past delivering a strong shock of 150 volts, and that all of them would quit entirely upon hearing the learners begging to be set free. Oh, to have the blind faith of being an expert. On to the experiment. All of the actor learners, after receiving their first fake shock of 300 volts, have been instructed beforehand to begin banging violently on the wall, demanding loudly to the observer to set them free. And after this, when their demands weren't met, they were told to become silent and refuse to answer further questions. Meanwhile, in the other room, after the teacher heard the learners' pleas, they were told by the instructor to treat silence as an incorrect answer and to deliver an even more powerful shock. And it was at this point that most of the teachers began to question whether the experiment should continue. But they did, because the instructor then began commanding them in an authoritative voice and using a pre-planned series of instructions, such as, please continue, to the experiment requires you to continue, to it is absolutely essential that you continue, to finally, you have no other choice, you must go on. Now remember, the teacher's obedience was being measured by the level of pain they were willing to inflict, and while many of them became agitated, distraught, angry, and sometimes even cried, the majority followed the commands all the way up to and including hitting the final switch and delivering a deadly shock. In fact, during the experiment, not one teacher stopped until they'd given their learner at least one 300-volt shock. And even more mind-blowing, 65% of them, that's 24 out of the 40, continued to obey the instructor's orders until they punished the learner to the very end of the scale. Milgram's experiment became an instant classic, demonstrating the danger of blind obedience. His research proved that immoral commands given by a person in authority to some people will make them almost instantly abandon all of their most deeply held moral and religious beliefs. But if there's one good thing that did come from follow-up experiments, it was that if just a couple people refused to follow the commands of the instructor, the obedience level of all the teachers declined, but only when they were told beforehand that other teachers refused to follow orders. And then at that point, over 90% of them refused to deliver any more shocks. Now personally, I believe there are at least two other important things we need to learn from this experiment. One, when enough people stand up and refuse to follow immoral or illegal orders from a person who thinks they have authority, that person or group soon learns they have no authority. You see, there's only a few of them and millions of us. And secondly, and this is by far the most important lesson, on May 31st, 1962, Adolf Eichmann, the conductor, for blindly following immoral orders, was executed by hanging.